item on the agenda is House Bill 3069, number 5 on your agenda, 3069. Councilman,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The purpose of this bill is to add a restriction to the general policy allowing persons to possess firearms in their vehicles while in a parking lot. Current West Virginia law is that any owner, lessee, or other person charged with the care, custody, and control of real property can prohibit the open carry of firearms on their property. But the bill we passed last year made it so that you could have a vehicle out of sight locked in a vehicle in a parking lot. This bill attempts to place in code language, which I believe was borrowed from Texas, relating to securing firearms in cars which are parked on the properties of chemical plants and refineries. The section of code that is amended adds a subsection which effectively bars firearms being placed in automobiles which are parked within the secured perimeters of such facilities. That's the bill before the committee, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, counsel. Are there questions for counsel on the bill? Questions? Gentleman from the 15th.
I was looking, defined under this of the exempted, it says a chemical manufacturing facility or oil and gas refinery operating under an air quality permit issued in West Virginia. How is that defined for a chemical manufacturing facility or oil and gas refinery? Is it?
Well, I think an oil and gas refinery is fairly self-explanatory. I mean, a chemical facility might be a little more amorphous, but these are basically going to be facilities of that type which have obtained an air quality permit. I think that would probably provide us with enough of a limitation that we could understand what those facilities were.
Well, my confusion is if you look at your West Virginia DEP air quality permits, there is an air quality permit for oil and gas refineries, but there's not for chemical manufacturing. So I was just wondering how that would be defined.
Gentleman,
if we're defining it by the air quality permit.
The gentleman has me on that one.
All right, thank you.
Gentleman from the 35th, followed by the gentleman from the 60th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Vice Chairman. Well, I'll give you Chairman. You can have that. The council, it states in the abstract that this language was borrowed from Texas. How
Yes,
many other states follow the language that Texas has?
I know that Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana all have similar language. I'm not sure as the other states, but I know that those three all have fairly similar language. I think Mississippi was also one that has fairly similar language.
Do you know of any states in the country that follow what we currently have?
I do not know, sir.
At the appropriate time, if somebody would know.
Sure. Gentleman from the 60th, followed by the gentleman from the 37th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, counsel. Under current law, is it legal to have a firearm locked in your car in the parking lot at work in any of these facilities?
Yes, sir.
Is it under current law, is it legal to remove that firearm from your vehicle on the parking lot of that facility?
No, sir.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from the 37th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Brian, do you know, what are the rules for, types of chemicals that would have to be stored underground as opposed to above ground? I guess I have to ask somebody from industry about that.
You would. I know that with proper pressurization, you can store nearly anything above ground, provided that the vessel is strong enough and that the container around the vessel is strong enough.
Well, I remember when there was the concern about the chemical at an institute that they were storing.
Methyl isocyanate.
Yeah, that there were rules that had to be stored underground.
Yeah.
So I know there's certain types of chemicals, depending on their toxicity or whatever, that have to be stored underground, but I don't know what that rule is. Because I guess if what we're trying to prevent here is somebody shooting a tank and causing a lot of people harm, I want to know what would be in the tank that they'd be shooting at, or if it's or if that type of stuff that we need to be worried about is actually underground anyway.
I think you've accurately stated the sponsor's intent, and I can't answer, unfortunately, the specific questions on chemical storage that you have.
All right, the appropriate time, I'd like to ask somebody from industry.
The appropriate time, technical expertise has been requested in front of the committee, but first, are there further questions of council? Further questions of council? Seeing none, gentleman from the 35th requested leave of the committee to bring somebody with some technical expertise. Did you have an idea of who that was?
Somebody could answer the question about the different states that have been imposed.
Is there somebody here that can answer the question? Gentleman from the 35th? Ms.
Chairman can.
Hello, Mr. McPhail. You know the practice in the committee is to swear you in. And can you announce yourself to the committee first?
Sure. Rebecca McPhail with the West Virginia Manufacturers Association.
Swear you in. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Proceed. Gentleman from the 35th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. You might have heard my question. The only question I had is how many states, if you know, currently have the same law that's on the books in West Virginia?
I don't know of any state that has the exact same law that West Virginia has. I do know that there are 26 states that have parking gun lot bills. I mean, what they're commonly referred to, that allow employees to store firearms in some shape or form in a locked vehicle on company property. There are a number of exemptions depending on the type of business, depending on the type of industry. Also, the means in which the parking lot is defined as a secured area versus an area that is gated and restricted for plant access. So it's a little bit different everywhere, but as far as I know, West Virginia is the only one that has this type of legislation.
My only question, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from the 37th was, could this witness address your questions?
Well, we'll see.
Okay, please proceed.
Thank you,
I'll
Mr.
try.
Chairman. Did you hear the question about, like, I guess if the issue I think that the chemical industry has with the parking lot bill that we passed, was that last year?
Yes,
Yeah,
I think
last
so.
year. It seemed like a long time ago. But is that someone could, I guess, put a hole in a tank and it would cause a lot, harm to the community?
Sure.
Is that the concern?
I think it's understanding the way a chemical plant might be laid out. Some are some are different. Some have a parking lot that's separated from the plant, that's gated, that provides some distance between restricted area, flammable things, and others you actually have to drive into the physical plant property. Not everybody, but some folks do.
Okay.
So when we talk about parking lot, I think it was important how we defined it, and so we left that very ambiguous before. So there's a concern that accidental discharge could happen. Of course, we don't think that anybody necessarily is coming into the plant with malice, but we just want to avoid a situation that creates safety concerns for employees or the broader community, as you said.
All right. Well, did you hear my question about what the rule is with what types of chemicals have to be stored underground?
I'm not as familiar with the underground storage tank provisions as I am the above ground storage tank provisions, because we've spent a lot of time on those over the last few years. So I couldn't speak to those restrictions.
Well, I remember it being an issue around here in the Kanawha Valley with the a leak out at Institute, where there were rules where certain types of chemicals have to be stored underground. Am I wrong?
I'm not certain of that. I'm happy to find out.
By then, we'll probably already vote on it, but thanks.
Sorry.
Gentleman from the 27th was next. Did you have questions of this witness?
I did.
Gentleman from the 27th.
We prepared and submitted to the committee a package of information on 3 other states, Texas being one of them, Mississippi, and let me get the other one, Louisiana. And each of them had exceptions for, in the case of Texas, almost an identical exception to the one that's being proposed here. Mississippi, I believe, did not limit it to chemical or oil and gas facilities, just any private employer. And then Louisiana basically limited it to those employers that have hazardous activities. My question to you is, in the future, if the state attempts to realize growth from the opportunities presented by the oil and gas developments in the north central part of the state and the ethane and other type of derivatives from that, would the absence of this type of protection for industrial chemical plants make our state less competitive than the states that we would be competing with, like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas?
I do know that other business groups have targeted these types of bills without restrictions as job-killing bills for that very reason, because it does create a lack of latitude for employers to create the safest possible work environment in those types of industries. And I think your point about Louisiana and Texas are kind of our peers, what we strive to be from a chemical and petrochemical production perspective and industry growth. So I think that could be the case.
It could make us less competitive than those states for those industries.
Yes.
Thank you.
Gentleman from 15th, did you have some questions for the witness?
Yes, I did.
Proceed.
My question is, on these tanks, the stated issue was that one of these tanks may be shot and cause problems due to the nature of the chemicals. Is that correct?
That was someone else's statement, not mine.
Okay, and that's what I'm wondering, trying to get to that statement of what thickness are these tanks?
That varies. It depends on the construction, what they're going to hold, the life expectancy of the tank. I mean, they're all built for different things. Some mobile sources may not have the thickness as something that's stationary and that's going to, need to be there for years and years. So, I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint. There's not an exact on any of those. It's equipment, just like in other industries. There's diversity all over the plant.
And are these tanks visible from beyond the borders of the? Are they visible from beyond the borders of the facility?
Many are, and certainly we aren't able to prohibit someone from standing on I-64 and shooting at one of the chemical plants there. That's not what we're trying to do in supporting this type of amendment. I think what we're trying to do is within our plant environment create the safest possible work environment for our employees. And, I know there are controls that we can't dictate, but this is certainly one of those that we think should be considered when we are developing our internal policies.
But they are visible from beyond the borders of
Sure.
the facility?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Lady from the 39th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ma'am, I have a question about the accidental firing of a gun. They're on a parking lot. They're in their own vehicle. So maybe they're taking it out of the holster and putting it in their glove box and misfire. Or maybe they're taking it, putting it in the trunk in a box and locking it up and then misfire. How's that going to damage a tank that's on another part of the property?
I think we are maybe limiting this too much to a tank. That's become kind of the focal point. I think there are a lot of different things in a chemical environment. There are process vessels, there are pipes and lines and things.
But do you keep those in the parking lot?
In some cases, they're adjacent to a parking lot. I mean, again, I think one of the things that we talked about when we discussed this bill last year was, okay, is there a way to define a parking lot so that it has some, more standard definition or a perimeter? In the cases of a chemical plant here in the valley, you physically drive onto an island where the plant is located. Some of the employees have to do that in order to do their jobs. And there's parking that's right in the physical plant facility. That's not the case with everything. But in those instances, then certainly that could create some safety concerns.
And one more question. So when they're building these tanks and putting them out on the property, do they do gun firings, 38, 22, blah, 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 to see what might penetrate? I mean, handguns, that'd be kind of hard to penetrate either.
Sure, I'm sure it would be, but I'm not sure of how the different manufacturers that make this equipment test it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Gentleman from the 29th, followed by the lady from the 65th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question would be, it seems that you're aware of this legislation in other states and so forth that pertains to keeping a firearm by an employee in a locked car in the parking lot. Are you aware of any instances where a firearm is discharged in a parking lot of one of these facilities in this state or any other states that's caused any harm?
I'm not aware of that, but I think as responsible business, we have to consider all possibilities of that type of accident on a plant site. We're aware of a lot of other industrial accidents that never happened before, and once they did, the consequences were pretty dire. And then legislative action needs to be taken to prevent that or to minimize those types of risks moving forward. We just, think this is an opportunity to minimize that risk before it happens.
Now, we've talked a little bit about dangerous chemicals and things like that. These facilities that we're talking about, like, say, the island facility that you're talking about, would those have more substantial safety measures than a gas station that you would commonly find on the highway?
I would imagine, yeah.
So, to go with your point of preventing disasters, wouldn't it be just as equally dangerous to pull into a gas station with a loaded gun in your vehicle?
I imagine the folks that own gas stations would need to argue whether or not they think that's the case.
Okay. Do you have any statistics on accidental discharge of firearms at all that you're aware of?
I don't.
Okay. I would ask for leave from somebody else at the appropriate time that might have that information.
Appropriate time, thank you. Lady from the 65th.
Chairman or Vice Chairman. Typically, I do err on the side of safety. However, I do want to ask a few questions about how you're going to scale this.
Okay.
How would we enforce this on any sort of manufacturing plant or business go forward?
I think every company does that differently. Certainly before the bill passed last year, we had signage, and in some cases, in those instances where they're going through a gated area, a basic search of a vehicle. So I think it just depends on the facility and the site, how they would enforce.
Would it be fair to say that we're asking for a statewide mandate on something that probably is a localized control issue?
Gosh, I think what we're doing is we're taking something that used to be at the business's discretion, in this case, chemical manufacturers and refineries, at the discretion of the facility, and we're now mandating how they are to monitor and implement safety procedures at their facility.
Fair. And then what kind of foreseen projected costs would you see across each manufacturing plant? Because I know signage would be one thing, but then I'd imagine now you're going to need things like armed guards, officers, metal detectors, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I think when we talked about this bill originally, when the changes went into effect that removed the employer's ability to prohibit firearms on the parking lots, that's when we incurred a lot of additional costs, because that's when we went from having, just regular security to allow people in and out of the gates to armed security in some instances, depending on the type of facility and the restrictions within the plant. So I don't have an exact number in terms of cost. I think it would be different for different facilities depending on how they implement.
Mm-hmm. Back home, I have Procter & Gamble right now. They're in place. How would you see this being implemented in a plant like that? Or if at all, do you see if there's any
It may
sort of
not.
competition?
I think that what you have, and if memory serves, I think at Procter & Gamble, they have a parking area that is not unlike Toyota in Putnam County. It's gated, it's fenced off, then you have to access the plant through other means. That isn't the case for some facilities who, as we talked about a little while ago, have parking lots within the physical plant structure.
Do you feel that this is a huge undertaking or even an additional accrued cost between the laws that were already passed and now adding this one to the mix?
I think this gives chemical manufacturers and refineries some flexibility. They may not change. They may not go back to those types of prohibitions in a lot of cases, but the ones that do have a unique circumstance and parking within the facilities may think that that's the right direction to go.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.
I saw the gentleman from the 23rd first, and then I'll come to the gentleman from the 20th.
Ms. McPhail, are you aware if there's ever been, either now or ever been, any conditions of employment that's been set forth by the industry over the possession or use of firearms on property?
Not conditions of employment so much as a policy. Before we had some companies that had prohibitions because of the type of facility, and not complying with that could have disciplinary results.
Is that a notice that's given the employee when they're initiated, when they're hired?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, in the cases that we're aware of, yes.
Okay. Are you aware if there's policy and procedures in place now that still address that?
Well, I think there would be policies and procedures relative to being in the physical plant or outside of the car as it is now. But that varies from employer to employer and how they implement and do that.
Is it fair to say that outside the vehicle, that you would assume that they have some type of policy or procedure in place for firearms outside of the vehicle?
I would imagine the largest percentage would.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Chairman. Ma'am, I'm reading the abstract that's in front of us on this proposed legislation. And in part, it says this effectively bars firearms and automobiles which are parked within secure perimeters of such facilities we're talking about. And I understand that. I guess my question is, from a logical standpoint, having been an employee in the industry before going into self-employment, most people leave from home and go straight to work. If this is followed from a technical perspective, would this almost be a de facto prohibition on a person carrying a firearm in their car to and from work? I mean, would it operate that way if they're going to a facility such as this? Because I imagine there's no place to house these firearms before they get to the facility. If you could give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't determine whether or not that is the legal precedent that would be set. I just know that in other states, provisions have been made, whether that's providing parking outside of the facility as we talked about, or providing a storage option for firearms. Again, we just seem to have kind of gone as far as we could go with it, which limits the employer's ability to set policies within their physical property. So I'm sorry I can't answer your question better.
Thank you.
Further questions for Ms. McPhail? Yes, gentleman from the 32nd.
Thank you, Ms. McPhail, for being here. I have the greatest respect for you, and I wanted to hear if you had any data on the employment situation. The chairman asked you a question, could it make us, West Virginia, less competitive than other states? Are you aware of any data where an employer did not locate into the state of West Virginia? Because we've had this now for a year. And are you aware of any data that an employer did not move into the state of West Virginia because of our existing code?
I am not aware of any employer that specifically didn't cite here because of that. I think you would probably agree that there are a lot of reasons that folks do or don't decide to locate in West Virginia. This certainly could be part of that checklist, but I haven't specifically been told that someone has declined to come here for that reason.
Okay. And what about other states? Are you aware of any employer or potential business that did not locate into a state because they had similar code as we have now, allowing guns to be locked in a vehicle?
Well, as we've discussed and heard, and as I've learned in my research, West Virginia is the only state that applies this as broadly. So it's not, it's not really an apples and oranges comparison. As the chairman mentioned, Texas has exceptions for these types of facilities. Louisiana has exceptions for these types of facilities. Missouri, who's looking at this kind of law now, that's running through their legislation, considers, as I mentioned before, alternative storage at the plant site for firearms. And I think that might even be more broadly for all businesses to provide that option to employees. They provide a definition of a parking lot that kind of gives some separation between the physical facility and a parking space. So I think it's hard to make that comparison.
Okay, and again, are you aware of any employer that has not moved into a particular state because of the ability in some form or fashion for an employee to have a weapon in their vehicle?
I'm not aware of that, but I haven't actually looked into that, so I can't say that that doesn't exist.
Okay, thank you.
Gentleman from the 6th.
Just one question. To follow up on the gentleman's question, does anyone ask if they're thinking about locating here? Is anyone saying, well, how restrictive are West Virginia's gun laws with regard to chemical plants? Anyone asking that question?
Well, and maybe I should back up and say I'm not sure that I'm the right person to ask that. I generally work with the companies that are here doing business here. I think someone in the Department of Commerce or the Office of Development may be more informed on that type of issue.
Okay. Is there somebody here that
Maybe at the
appropriate time I might be able to
And I
direct
don't know
that
if there's
question?
anyone here.
Good. I think the gentleman from the 37th has a question of counsel. Am I correct? Let's wait until we're finished with our witnesses, and then we'll return to questions of counsel. Just a quick question from the chair, Ms. McPhail. Following up on what the gentleman from the 20th said, this would not restrict an employee from bringing a firearm to work. It would it would restrict them bringing a firearm to work in a restricted area.
It's my understanding that that's...
Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding of the amendment, or the new language.
Thank you. Are there further questions of Ms. McPhail before we let her off the hook? Gentleman from the 60th.
No, there's no uh-oh. I just want clarification. Just want clarification on that last comment. So, just to clarify, this is to prevent them from bringing it into the parking lot of a restricted area and leaving it in their locked vehicle in the parking lot of a restricted area.
My read of 3069 clearly says restricted area.
But the parking lot, leaving it inside their locked vehicle, is that not correct?
If the parking lot is part of a restricted area, then yes.
So that's the real concern here. It's not, I would never support them walking into a restricted area, brandishing their weapon or anything like that. But what we're actually talking about here is preventing them from parking in the parking lot and leaving a weapon in their locked vehicle inside a restricted area. In other words, it's to allow that restriction on that parking lot.
I guess so, but sure.
Thank you for the clarification. Gentleman from the 27th, a question, follow-up?
Just a question of the chair. My understanding is there's a citation presentation the gentleman from the 35th has orchestrated for the state police that a number of our members want to attend. I would suggest we recess until after the floor session to allow those who want to attend that presentation. We'll resume with this. That would be my motion for a recess.
Does anybody have discussion on the motion to recess until after the floor session? All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. We're in recess. Thank you for being back here. We're finishing up questions from Rebecca McPhail with the West Virginia Manufacturers Association. I think that questioning was completed. So we're going to continue on with expertise. Yes, gentleman from 37th have an inquiry? Sure. Question of counsel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Council, we passed I guess what we called the parking lot bill last year. There's a provision in there that says an employer cannot ask an employee if they have a gun in their car. How would this bill affect that?
It would not alter that provision at all.
So we had this about chemical companies or gas and oil companies. They wouldn't be able to ask their employee if they had a gun in the car?
That's correct.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. There's been additional requests for technical expertise, so the gentleman from the 27th seeks leave from the committee to call a witness. To the gentleman?
I assume there's no objection.
Is there objection? Hearing none. Please proceed.
I'd like to call Kelly Goes, please.
Ms. Goes, if you please come to the microphone here and introduce yourself to the committee, and then I will swear you in, which is customary with the practice of this committee.
Kelly Goes. I'm an attorney with Jackson Kelly and also work on lobbying and am giving additional technical information on behalf of the WVMA and my client, Covestro.
Could you please raise your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
I do.
Thank you. Please proceed. Gentleman from the 27th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Goes, the bill deals with, or the amendment to the current law deals with chemical manufacturing facilities and oil and gas refineries whose primary business is conducted in the manufacture, use, storage, or transportation of hazardous, combustible, and explosive materials. A lot of the focus this morning was on these large outside or outdoor tanks. Are there other concerns with regard to the facilities of these chemical manufacturing plants or oil and gas refineries with respect to the presence of loaded firearms within their enclosed facilities?
So in a restricted area for a chemical manufacturing facility, there are a lot of safety concerns in general. The restricted areas that we are talking about include many restrictions, not just firearms. In some locations, it could be everything from cigarette lighters to cell phones to things like that. So this is part of an overall safety concern based on the location, the restricted areas within the location, the infrastructure, the chemicals, and the other sensitive instrumentation on site.
Are there other things besides large outdoor tanks that could be impacted by either the spark from a discharge or the friction caused by the bullet or projectile from the firearm?
Depending on the site, there could be pipes and other types of infrastructure. There could be chemicals and things that are stored in other manners. There could be a variety of other types of instrumentation or sensitive equipment that might be impacted by that. Again, the restricted area concerns are not done by category of item. They are done to restricted area concerns to keep for the safety of the operation.
So, for instance, if there are piping that communicates between the storage tank to another facility or actually facilitates the transport of the chemicals into a transport device like a truck or a barge or something, those could be impacted as well, could they not?
That's correct. There's piping, there's instrumentation, there's computer systems. These are very complex operations. And again, as the bill says, this only applies to the restricted area. The bill also requires there to be supervised secured parking on the site itself for the employees in the event that there's also parking within the restricted area. And all chemical facilities, there would not necessarily be parking for the employees within the restricted area.
So in other words, if there's a restricted area, in order for this provision to operate, there would have to be other parking provided reasonably available for the employees, correct?
That's correct, and that would be a fairly standard setup for a lot of these facilities.
All right, thank you.
Further questions for Ms. Goes? Yes, gentleman from the 29th, please.
Yes, Ms. Goes, you seem to know quite a bit about the industry, and I'd asked this question of a different witness earlier. You know, in your practice of representing these types of companies in the industries, are you aware of any incidents at all of an accidental discharge of a firearm causing a disaster at one of these facilities?
No.
Okay. Now, arguably, we're talking about a parking lot where the firearm is stored in a locked compartment, and we're being concerned about a spark from that, maybe igniting some foreign chemical. Wouldn't it stand to reason that just starting your vehicle would basically do the same thing?
I can't speak for the specific security concerns that have been taken into account. That's its own separate department in many of these large companies. But I do know that there are many restrictions on site and they include many other items. So as far as we're concerned, this isn't necessarily a gun restriction bill. On the other parking facility, there would be no prohibition against it. As council pointed out, we can't even ask our employees if they have them on site. This is strictly in a restricted area, the best practices based on the security experts hired by the companies.
Okay. And I wouldn't have any further questions.
Gentlelady from the 39th.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Ma'am, thank you for being here. So if we pass this law to your satisfaction, what's to keep the company from coming out and then making the other parking lot a secured area?
I don't know the definition of restricted area.
Well, you're the one that's telling us you don't want us to have them in a restricted area. So whatever that meaning means to you, the parking lot where we can now go in and have our gun in our car, the company can then come back and say, well, now we're designating this as another restricted area.
Well, for clarification, all we're talking about is the existing restricted areas. Many things are restricted for safety concerns.
But they could change that if they so chose.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay,
I don't know if that's prescribed by something else.
Okay, thank you.
Gentleman from the 60th.
Chairman, thank you, ma'am, for being here. I appreciate you. So you mentioned lighters and cell phones as specific examples of items that are restricted or not allowed in restricted areas.
It could be. It's all company-based.
Okay. So a lighter makes sense. You got a chemical plant. Of course, you have to activate the lighter for that to become an issue. But I can imagine that if you've got a lighter, it's in your pocket, you're playing around with it, but you've got it on your person, that's an issue. A cell phone, of course, our cell phones often activate without our personal interaction with them. Somebody calls, somebody texts, whatever, you get an update. So that update, that happens, and I'm aware of how a cell phone signal can interfere with instrumentation, that sort of thing, and that's an issue. So what I'm trying to understand is our concern that, as the gentleman from the 29th said, that the flash from a weapon going off would ignite something, or that the actual projectile would cause a problem? It seems to me those are both issues, but both issues that result from one thing, which is activating the weapon. So if the weapon is locked inside a car that's parked in the parking lot, it's not real likely to activate.
So I cannot speak to the
Yes,
specific concerns. I'm not a safety expert. Okay. I guess all we were trying to do is explain that there are many objects, to your point, that are normally benign, that are excluded from these restricted areas based on the company's desire to keep the location safe.
Yes, ma'am. And I've written a lot of policy, and I've also come up with a lot of best practices, and I've done a lot of risk analysis in operations that I've done. And there's always a specific reason for each restriction, each prohibition, each limitation, whatever it is. And I'm just trying to get to the meat of the matter and try to figure out why there would be a specific limitation against a weapon locked in a car with no one around it. And
I apologize, I'm not the one to answer that.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions of Ms. Goes? Further questions? Thank you, Ms. Goes. If you wouldn't mind signing our sheet here, I'd appreciate it. Further leave to the committee has been requested by the gentleman from the 27th to call a further witness. Is there objection? Hearing none.
I'd like to call Art Toms.
Welcome back to the committee, Mr. Tom. I'm going to ask you to announce yourself to the committee, please, and then we'll swear you in.
Art Tom, National Rifle Association.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Gentleman from the 27th.
Mr. Toms, is it Tom or Toms?
Tom.
Mr. Tom, what is your position with the National Rifle Association?
I'm the state director for the state of West Virginia.
Are you familiar with I'll call them the NRA's website that they often broadcast information on?
I'm familiar with the website, yes.
Let me hand you a printout from the website that's dated as of Tuesday, August 30, 2011, and direct your attention to the first sentence there that reads, and I'll read it and just tell me if I'm reading it correctly. NRA backs Senate Bill 321 takes effect this Thursday, September 1st. Is that what it says?
It does.
And this deals with the Texas Employee Parking Lot Protection Bill?
It seems so.
Yes. And that bill apparently was backed, according to that statement on the website of the NRA, by the NRA. Is that correct?
It appears so. I was an employee of the NRA at the time.
All right, I direct your attention to further down where it says the provisions of this is the end of the second paragraph. The provisions of this bill or the bill do not apply to the following. You see that language?
I do, sir.
And then the fourth bullet point down there says property owned or leased by a chemical manufacturer or oil and gas refiner permitted by the TCEQ, which is the equivalent of our DEP, and on which the primary business conducted is the manufacture, use, storage, or transportation of hazardous, combustible, or explosive materials. However, employees at these facilities who are CHLs, obviously permit holders, may store firearms, including rifles or shotguns, in their private motor vehicles in parking areas located out of secured and restricted areas which contain the physical plant, are not open to the public, and which are constantly monitored by security personnel. Did you see that provision?
Yes, sir.
And this is the bill that was backed by the NRA according to its website. Is that correct?
It would appear so. Again, I was not employed by the NRA at the time.
Can you tell us what policy concerns there would be that would treat West Virginia any differently than the state of Texas with respect to its chemical manufacturers or oil and gas refiners?
Mr. Chairman, the state of West Virginia, each state in the union is unique in its laws and legislature, and I represent the state of West Virginia, not the state of Texas or any other state. I was discussing this matter actually earlier with a couple of the other folks that have opposite interest in the bill, and I can't necessarily speak to that. To me, it's kind of like when my boys come home and tell me that Johnny's parents allow him to do something, and well, I'm not Johnny's parents, I'm my son's parents, and I represent the state of West Virginia, not Texas. But I understand your questioning.
So you can't think of any policy reasons why the state of West Virginia should be treated any differently than the state of Texas, as far as this provision is concerned?
Mr. Chairman, the state of West Virginia passed a law that prevented employers from being able to discriminate against lawful gun owners in the state of West Virginia last year. Similar amendments were poised last year and were defeated. The National Rifle Association does not support any further restrictions on lawful firearms carrying in the state of West Virginia.
I understand your position. What I'm trying to find out is why your position is different in West Virginia than it is in Texas.
I can't speak to the directors for those states.
All right, thank you. Oh, one other question. Can you certify to the members of the committee there's never been an accidental discharge of a firearm in a parking lot?
Well, as far as a self-accidental discharge, a firearm self-discharging, I can say that as what some would consider me a firearms expert, I have an instructor certified by the National Rifle Association. I have not heard of any firearms self-discharging, any modern firearms, more specifically discharging, and even more so in a vehicle, and have not read or received, nor through all our research, have seen any media reports of that happening in a vehicle in an employer's parking lot.
And my question was more directed toward an accidental discharge that might have occurred as a result of handling the weapon or moving it from one position in the car to the other. Can you certify that's never happened either?
I don't know if that's ever happened outside. I don't know.
Thank you. That's all.
Further questions for Mr. Tom. Gentleman from the 15th, followed by gentleman from the 59th, followed by the gentleman from the 29th.
My question is on, we talked about Texas and their exception into the bill. The NRA as an organization, have they ever had exceptions put into their bill that would bring somebody on board and they wouldn't oppose the bill just because of an exception that, or what's the best way, a compromise? You wouldn't propose one of your lead-sponsored bills just because a compromise was accepted.
That would be a fair statement.
So is it very possible, I know you weren't employed, but is it very possible that a bill that was put forward in Texas may have been a compromise?
That's a possibility.
All right, thank you.
Gentleman from the 59th. Proceed.
I have a question. It's my understanding that the NRA is all about the Second Amendment and those protections. However, the abstract from this bill indicates that there are no constitutional issues identified in this bill. Do you agree with that?
I don't agree with that.
And why do you not agree with it?
Because there's a constitutional right to keep and bear arms in the United States, as well as in the Constitution of the state of West Virginia, and to possess a lawful firearm in the private property or personal property, as the West Virginia State Tax Department calls it, would continue on there, especially with the constitutional carry law that we have in effect as of 2016.
Thank you.
Gentleman from the 29th?
Yes. Now, Mr. Tom, you've been employed here in West Virginia for a few years with the NRA. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Would it be safe to say that you're well aware of different industry positions on our gun laws and how that impacts their decisions in our state?
Beyond my employment with the National Rifle Association, I was involved in a franchise for a national staffing company in the state of West Virginia for 20 years prior, so I specifically have knowledge of that, yes.
Okay. We're specifically talking about the oil and gas and the chemical industry a lot here today. Are you aware of any companies that haven't moved into the state because of our lack of a protection on this parking lot bill that is proposed today?
I'm not, and as mentioned before, beyond that, it would strike me as odd that an oil and gas company would not come to where oil and gas is because of the potential of a lawful firearm in a vehicle in a parking lot.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about these accidental discharges. We're talking about firearms in this bill that are locked and secured in an employee's vehicle and not being handled. Have you encountered, and I know this has been asked in several different ways, but I think this is the direct way I'm asking it at least. Have you encountered or been informed of any incidents of that type of a firearm locked in a vehicle going off in a parking lot and causing an industrial disaster of any sort?
No, sir.
We had heard earlier that, in these chemical facilities there could be gaseous fumes and things like that. With your knowledge of firearms and so forth, in my mind, it would be just as dangerous to start a vehicle as have a firearm go off in that situation with those fumes going off. Would that be accurate for me to believe that?
I would believe so. There's actually a spark versus a piece of metal sitting in one spot, so I would say you're correct.
Okay. Going back to talking about the Texas bill, and other members of the committee have brought up the process through which Texas came up with their legislation. Were you a part of, were you working for the NRA in West Virginia when we adopted the parking lot bill?
Yes, sir.
Did Texas adopt these measures in regards to oil and gas far after the bill had been enacted, like it's being proposed here today? Or was that part of the original bill?
I can't speak to that. I was not employed at the time.
You weren't in Texas. Okay, I'm sorry. I have nothing further.
Thank you. There was someone before. The gentleman from the 16th, then gentleman from the 37th.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here, Mr. Tom. I just have a couple of questions. One, do you foresee the NRA ever coming to West Virginia to open a manufacturing facility or
no
anything? No. Do you foresee any other businesses wanting to come here and possibly open in West Virginia?
I'm gonna kind of just interject. That's not within the scope of Mr. Tom's expertise.
Well, okay.
So if you can try to rephrase, I'll give you a little bit of leniency, but he's here to speak on behalf of the National Rifle Association.
All right. Today, we were talking about, and this is kind of simmering on in, we've talked about guns and a possible discharge on their own or that kind of thing. What about, and I know this may seem odd, but we had this problem in Ohio not too long ago. What if somebody has a van or whatever full, let's say there are fireworks and that kind of stuff. I'm talking the big ones. Is there, in your estimation, could that cause a problem?
Certainly, but the explosives ordinance are under a completely different section of code.
Which includes fireworks and that kind of stuff too, I would say.
It does.
Doesn't it? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Gentleman from the 37th.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Tom. So that's kind of a follow-up, I guess. I think it was the questions from the gentleman from the 59th talking about the constitutional issues. Because this is what interests me about this bill, and the same thing that interests me last year about this bill, that your organization was wholeheartedly behind, if I remember correctly. So for me, it's about the Second Amendment rights and property rights, okay? Now, you're saying that the right to your own personal property as like inside your own car, that would override a company's right to property that owns their parking lot?
Yes, sir. If there's a binding employment contract where an employer has invited or given a space for the employee to park their personal car, we believe so, yes.
Okay. So, but that wouldn't apply to like, say they didn't have a space just for that employee. Maybe they're a place that hires temporary employees, but it's still a space for employees. What about other businesses that just like for like say they weren't an employee there, that they were doing some sort of other business there? Do you think they would still have that same right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So your right to what's in your car overrides somebody else's personal property right? Or property rights?
And more specifically in the state of West Virginia, the legislature has deemed appropriate to place a yearly tax on what they call a personal property tax on vehicles, which would then, under that definition, I believe, make that considered personal property or private property that you have rights to, that then the Constitution, just as in your home, you should be able to be afforded the rights that falls under that. The state of West Virginia has included those rights.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm asking them the questions.
I understand the lady's
I'll
direct the witness to answer the question within the scope of his expertise.
Thank you. I thought I was. I'm speaking to the code, not to what the West Virginia legislature has passed, not to how an attorney may interpret it.
Okay. Well, okay. The state also, it's the counties too. The counties charges a real property tax, right? Those companies are paying a real property tax for their parking lot. So, but in your opinion, someone's right to do what they want in their personal property overrides what someone sees fit on their real property?
That's his opinion. Let's ask
Well, that kind of gets to the heart of what this bill's about, whether or not property rights whether gun rights are more important than property rights.
And to the gentleman, I'm happy to allow you to make that during your closing argument, but the witness is not here to give his opinion on what is proper and what's not proper.
All right, well, I mean, if they're the ones who pushed the bill, I figured he'd know, but thank you.
Further questions of Mr. Tom? Further questions? None? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Tom. If you would not mind. Actually, quick question from the chair. If I invite you, I'm just looking for clarity here. If I invite you to my house, are under the current West Virginia law, let's say for some reason I didn't want you to have a firearm on my property, if I posted that, I guess, on the gate on my farm and you brought one in, are you lawfully allowed? I'm just looking for clarity. I figured you would know that.
Absolutely. And under the current law, under West Virginia law, signs have no bearing on law.
Okay.
So if you were to post a sign on the fence and a person was to drive onto the property or walk onto the property with a firearm on their person, you as the resident landowner or controller of the property could ask that person to leave. If they decided against that, then they could be potentially charged with a trespassing violation.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. Appreciate you being here. Does anybody else? Yeah, gentleman from the 9th.
Just wonder if with leave of committee, I can ask a question to someone from industry again.
Leave of the committee has been requested to recall perhaps somebody from industry to testify. Is there objection to the gentleman's request? Hearing none. Ms. McPhail, is that who you?
Just someone that
or Ms.
possibly could
Goes?
answer. We'll find out.
Okay. Let's start with Ms. McPhail. Ms. McPhail, you're still under oath, as you know, so I'll allow you to proceed from the swearing that you took earlier this morning. And when you get to the mic, I'll let the gentleman from the 9th proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ma'am, I just wonder if you're familiar with 33 CFR 105.305?
Not specifically familiar.
Okay, just maybe the definite is facility security risk assessment that is done by the federal government. If it's a waterways facility, it's done by the U.S. Coast Guard. You're familiar with that?
I am.
And in those assessments, during those assessments, we take in effect, I say we've past tense of one of my duties, but we've taken in account the risk of inside the plant in secured areas. Would you agree with that?
I'll take your word for that.
And with those risk assessments, we have to take in account any time that a maritime security level was increased due to a threat, possible, either domestic terrorism or international terrorism threat, then the MARSEC level, known as MARSEC level, is increased. And with this bill, and if it doesn't pass, and the MARSEC level is increased, as we all know, that with increased levels like MARSEC, then there's other policies that have to be taken in place. Do you know anything about those?
I really don't. I mean, not to that level of detail.
Okay. And one of the things that would have to take place is higher security. And with that, then, we could be violating state code if indeed that would have to be ramped up, and no firearms would be allowed in secured areas. Would that make any sense to you as far as industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are federal regulations that we talked about last year that would conflict with state regulations in this case, and I believe we decided that those would have primacy in some cases.
I think what you're saying is the federal code of regulations take precedence over state law. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
And this could jeopardize some of our industries if they're stepping out of bounds of these threat assessments.
We've expressed those concerns, yes.
Thank you.
Further questions while Ms. McPhail is back at the microphone this afternoon? Seeing none, thank you for being here again. Do any other members desire to call technical witnesses to discuss the bill before us? Seeing none. Are there amendments? We have one at the podium. Yes, sir. I apologize. Gentleman from the 23rd.
Questions of council?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. Council, how, if we would adopt these provisions, how is this enforced?
To be fair, the gentleman's guess on that is as good as mine. I think because of the fact that the rest of the bill forbids questioning, I think the only way in which enforcement would come would be if there were some sort of open and obvious and apparent proof that a firearm was in the vehicle in a restricted area.
Would that require law enforcement interaction?
I think it almost certainly would.
On page 3, beginning in line 61, subsection B, when conducting an actual search of a motor vehicle, I'm assuming that that applies to the situations that we've been talking about today. As it gets down into line 63 and 64, motor vehicle may be only conducted by on-duty law enforcement personnel in accordance with statutory and constitutional protections.
That's correct, sir.
So is that going to require probable cause by a law enforcement officer to conduct a search of that motor vehicle?
I would absolutely think so.
Does this proposal that we're looking at, does that change that burden upon law enforcement to have probable cause in order to search a vehicle?
Not at all.
So I guess I'm getting back to the original question. How does the state of West Virginia, how does local law enforcement enforce the provisions that's outlined on page 4? From a practical standpoint.
From a practical standpoint, I think the gentleman has, as I said, went to your initial inquiry. Your guess is as good as mine, sir.
Thank you.
Gentleman from the 29th, question of counsel?
The gentleman from the 23rd brought up something that I think a lot of us may have actually missed now that I listened to the question. And was I mistaken when I heard Ms. McPhail earlier talk about employers searching the vehicle?
The gentleman's recollection of that is better than mine. I've had a headache all morning, so No, I had it when I got here, so I'm sorry, but your gentleman's recollection on that's better than mine.
It was my understanding from reading the bill and listening to Ms. McPhail's testimony that the employer would be searching the vehicle.
And that is explicitly forbidden under the terms of the statute that were referenced by the gentleman from Boone.
Does the revisions made here allow for one of these restricted area facilities? It was my understanding from Ms. McPhail's testimony that these new provisions would allow for a chemical company or an oil and gas company to search a private vehicle of an employee because of these heightened restrictions that we're putting into place.
The only way in which they would is that there is on line 81 the provisions of this subsection, which is subsection D, the prohibited act subsection, do not apply.
So the prohibition against a company search of your private vehicle would not apply to these companies
within these restricted areas.
So
what I'm saying is, when you say to these companies, it would apply to those companies in all property that the company had outside the restricted area. Now, within the restricted area, that would be the different situation.
Where does this bill define restricted area?
The bill does not define restricted area, to my knowledge.
So the employer defines restricted area because the legislature's failed to.
I would think that would be the default.
And just so we're all clear, to my recollection, there's no part of the Constitution of the United States of America or West Virginia that limits the ability of a private corporation to infringe upon your constitutional rights. That's a contract between the government and the citizen. There is no burden on a company to respect your Second, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh Amendment rights at all.
Well, we actually have had this discussion on numerous occasions here, and we've had with Second, Fifth, Sixth, not so much. First, there's always been some debate about. There have been numerous cases involving the ability of corporations to infringe on an employee's First Amendment rights, which have been contradictorily decided. There have been some with regard to two Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights have been contradictorily decided.
Reasonable search and seizure?
Rarely comes up in an employment context. I'm not an employment attorney, so you'd have to ask somebody who's got a lot better employment expertise than me as to the degree to which search and seizure. But generally speaking, because you're dealing with employees upon corporate property, they have generally been found to have a right to refuse search, but then the company can do as it pleases if they refuse the search.
Right. Talking about their Seventh Amendment rights while we're there. So if an employee was aggrieved and they've signed an arbitration agreement with this employer, that employer can make that employee sign an arbitration agreement that says you cannot bring a claim in court under these issues, and under West Virginia law, we uphold that. Is that correct?
Well, there was a gentleman here who used to serve in this body from Preston County who had a much higher view of your Seventh Amendment rights, but generally speaking, arbitration clauses have been upheld.
Right. So let's say that I am the victim of an unreasonable search and seizure in this restricted area by my employer, but I've signed an employment arbitration agreement that says that any claims of unreasonable search and seizure can't be brought in court. I couldn't even bring my case to court, right?
That is possible.
Okay. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions of counsel? Questions of counsel? Questions of counsel. Amendments. We have one at the chair offered by the gentleman from the 37th. On page 4, section 14, line 93. So we're going to add a section D after section C. It's going to be a new section, and it'll read as follows. Or property owned or leased by a religious organization. Does the gentleman from the 37th desire to explain the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Proceed.
We'll call this the, you can serve two masters amendment. If we're going to have a carve out for mammon, we're going to have a carve out for God. All right. I believe in the Second Amendment. I also believe in the First Amendment. And I think that when we passed this bill last year, we made a mistake by not having an exemption for religious institutions. It is against some folks' religious belief to have that weapon on their property, and I think we should also respect their First Amendment rights. I urge adoption of the amendment.
Are there questions of council as to the effect of the amendment? Questions of council as to the effect of the amendment? None? Discussion on the amendment before I allow the gentleman from the 37th to close. Gentleman from the 37th?
You want me to close?
If you'd like, it's your option.
It's
your
really
right.
Anything to rebut because nobody butted in there.
It's your right.
In light of some events, that have happened all around the world, and even more recently in Pittsburgh, this is a very important amendment to me, and I know that. Just exactly what I said before. I believe in the Second Amendment. I also believe in the First Amendment. People have religious freedom in this country. They should be able to worship how they want, and especially religious institutions should be able to govern their property how they want. And it's much different from an employee-employer relationship. It's about a congregant pulling in to safely, assemble and worship God the way they want to.
I've recognized the gentleman. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I wasn't quite done yet, but urge adoption of the amendment.
Roll call. Roll call's been demanded. Is demand sustained? Demand is sustained. Demand is sustained. Roll call's been requested. All those in favor will signify by saying aye or yes. All those opposed will signify by saying nay or no. Clerk will call the roll.
Delegate N. Brown.
Yes.
Delegate S. Brown.
Yes.
Delegate Byrd.
Yes.
Delegate Canastraro.
No.
Delegate Fast.
No.
Delegate Fleischhauer.
Yes.
Delegate Fluharty.
No.
Delegate Foster.
No.
Delegate Harshbarger.
No.
Delegate Holland. No. Delegate Kelly.
No.
Delegate Kessinger.
No.
Delegate Kump. Delegate Lovejoy.
No.
Delegate Malcolm.
No.
Delegate Mant.
No.
Delegate McGeehan. Delegate Miller. Delegate Pushkin. Delegate Queen. Delegate Robinson.
No.
Delegate Steele.
No.
Delegate Wilson.
No.
Delegate Shott.
Yes.
And Mr. Chairman.
No.
This is what we just learned.
On this votes, there are 6 yeses, 17 noes, 2 not voting. The amendment is rejected. Are there further amendments? Are there further amendments to the bill? Further amendments to the bill. Gentleman from the 27th to move the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that House Bill 3069 be reported to the full House with the recommendation that it do pass.
Is there discussion? Discussion? Discussion on the bill. Gentleman from the 27th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just explain the scope of this bill. First of all, this bill does not seek to repeal the parking lot bill. That bill passed last year. This bill does not seek to revoke or rescind that bill. So those rights will still remain in place. However, what the bill does seek to do is, in a very narrow, restricted exception, protect industries that that are in the primary business of manufacture, use, storage, or transportation of hazardous, combustible, or explosive materials. It seeks no greater protection than the NRA-backed bill in Texas for their parking lot protection. No greater protection, and as the gentleman from NRA said, he knows of no reason why we shouldn't extend the same protections to our industry. He has no policy reasons as to why West Virginia should receive less protection than the state of Texas. And that's important because one of the purposes of this bill is to allow West Virginia to continue to be competitive with states with whom we will be competing for industries to take advantage of the bonanza that we have in the oil and gas business, especially the byproducts of the natural gas, the ethanes, the propanes, all those type of chemicals. That's the natural, especially for the Kanawha Valley, for us to do. The limitation of this bill, though, so that everybody's clear on that, is it won't be taking advantage of every business that's operates that way. Only those, who provide an alternative parking area, okay? So that's going to be a cost of doing business for these people who decide to take, these businesses that tried to take advantage of this exception. And number 2, they have to have a restricted, if you read the provisions of the bill, restricted area containing the physical plan of the facility or refinery, which is secured and restricted and it's not open to the public, the ingress into which is constantly monitored by security personnel. So each of the industries in this type of business will have to make a decision, 1, based on risks, whether they need this type of secured area that's going to be monitored constantly by security personnel, and 2, that they will provide an alternative, reasonably available place to park for anyone who wants to take advantage of the rights that are provided in the bill that won't be affected by this bill. Number 2, I find it a little bit inconsistent, maybe not, and maybe even insulting to suggest, on the one hand, that employees will always follow the rules about securing their firearms in their glove box or trunk or so forth, and at the same time suggest that they won't voluntarily comply with a provision like this, that you'll have to actually search their vehicle. I think that's insulting to the employees to suggest, on the one hand, that they'll always comply with any restrictions about keeping their firearms safe and secured. On the other hand, that if there is a secured area that the company has determined constitutes a risk to the extent that they need to keep it constantly monitored by security personnel and provide separate parking, to suggest that they wouldn't voluntarily comply with those instructions. That to me is just not just inconsistent, but almost insulting. Finally, competition, of course, is a focus of this bill. We need to be competing. A lot of what we do here, and those of us who are Republicans have focused on trying to improve job prospects, and to remove obstacles to employment, trying to do everything we can to bring jobs to West Virginia. This puts us at a competitive disadvantage. Can we be sure that no business has decided to come here just because of this provision? No, you can't prove a negative like that. But on the checklist that's available to businesses, this will be one of the items that they look at. How can we control our own premises from a safety standpoint? From a safety standpoint, protecting our people and those who might be impacted should there be an unforeseen disaster. And that's the last part of this, safety. We say now, no, there have never been a discharge that resulted in a calamitous situation. No, but there never was a Bhopal, India either before those 5,000 people were killed because of a fracture of the equipment there due to a failure. We don't know when that can happen. We hope it never does under any circumstances. But the purpose of this bill is to prevent that kind of calamity, or to minimize, let me put it that way, to minimize the possibility that kind of calamity could happen here or anywhere else that could have enormous impacts by the discharge of a poisonous substance, by an explosion, or whatever. This is a very limited exception. It's reasonable. The people of Texas, who are no less conservative than the people of West Virginia, have approved this. I suggest to you we ought to improve it as well.
Further discussion. Gentleman from the 9th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to make it brief, many of us in here, we stand up and we try to do regulatory reform for the positive for businesses and for industry. This goes totally against that. We want business and industry to be able to regulate themselves the best they know how, or what the best practice that they feel to promote their business. And this goes against that. We're not allowing industry to self-regulate themselves on private property. Then my second thing is, just like I brought up, this could jeopardize the industry under the Code of Federal Regulations. And there is very hefty penalties for violating CFRs, very hefty penalties. We're talking six-figure penalties for minor infractions. This in itself could violate the CFRs. And, it could take away, when a assessment is done, they go through all the CFRs, they give them a passing or a non-pass. And they got a certain time frame to fix their violations without getting penalized. This very well could hurt industry by not having the security and the type of threat assessment that is required for each one of them. So for those facts, I believe that we need to consider this and vote aye. Thank you.
Further discussion. Gentleman from the 15th.
I would be opposed to this bill for multiple reasons, but first and foremost, the protections we put into the law for the Second Amendment last year is being, in my opinion, rolled back on this one, and it applies to somebody's personal vehicle. And that's the issue, is this is allowing the search, basically the search of somebody's personal vehicle. And another issue in this, as discussed by the gentleman from the 23rd, what's going to happen if they happen to believe that there's a firearm in the vehicle? Are the police going to be called and asked to search the vehicle? Are we going to run into that issue? And I believe that we are. And from another standpoint, if this bill would happen to go forward, we need to look in the fact of these manufacturing facilities aren't even the chemical, I believe it says chemical manufacturing facilities aren't even covered under this bill. The exception doesn't even apply to some of them, because if they don't have an air quality permit, it doesn't apply to them. So I believe that the bill may not even get to some of the facilities that are have been discussed by our vice chairman here. So I would urge rejection of the bill.
Further discussion. Hearing none. The question before the committee is the gentleman's motion to report out House Bill 3069 to the full House with a recommendation that it do pass. Roll call has been demanded. Is the demand sustained? Demand is sustained. All those in favor will vote aye or yes. All those opposed will vote nay or no, and the clerk will call the roll.
Delegate N. Brown.
No.
Delegate S. Brown.
No.
Delegate Byrd.
Yes.
Delegate Canastraro.
No.
Delegate Fast. Delegate Fleischauer.
Yes.
Delegate Fluharty.
No.
Delegate Foster.
No.
Delegate Hirschberger.
No.
Delegate Holland.
Yes.
Delegate Kelly.
No.
Delegate Kessinger.
No.
Delegate Kump.
No.
Delegate Lovejoy.
No.
Delegate Malcolm.
No.
Delegate Mant.
Yes.
Delegate McGeehan. Delegate Miller.
No.
Delegate Pushkin. Delegate Queen. Delegate Robinson.
No.
Delegate Steele.
No.
Delegate Wilson.
No.
And Delegate Shott.
Yes.
And Mr. Chairman.
Yes. On the question of the, on passage of the motion, there are 6 ayes, 17 nays, 2 members are absent. The gentleman's motion is rejected. The next bill on the schedule will come to you momentarily.
Next bill is the